Before we dive in, drop a quick hi in the comments. It may seem small, but trust me, it really helps YouTube share this story with more sci-fi fans like us. I'd love to see who's watching.
The knife came from the left. Cale Voren saw the blur before the intent. A man in a gray coat, moving against the foot traffic on Massachusetts Avenue, his shoulder dropping low, arm extending. The motion was wrong. Every human Cale had observed in his almost 1 year on Earth moved with a particular looseness, a casual inefficiency in their joints and gait that he had come to recognize as normal. This man moved with compression, economy, purpose that had been rehearsed. Prince Cale had never seen a human blade before. Tharvith weapons burned or shattered. They announced themselves with light and sound and heat. This thing was thin and quiet and caught the afternoon sun for a fraction of a second as it angled upward toward the soft space beneath his ribs. He did not move fast enough. The blade caught the outer layer of his diplomatic coat and skipped across the subcutaneous plating that ran along his flank. Every Tharvith carried the plating, a vestigial feature from an evolutionary period when their ancestors had needed it. It was not armor. It was cartilage, dense and layered beneath the skin, and the knife opened the fabric and scored a line across it that split the surface and drew violet blood in a thin streak across gray skin. The pain was minor. The shock was not. Cale stumbled sideways into the door of a parked vehicle. The impact jolted through his shoulder. The attacker lunged again, closing the distance with a short step that kept his weight centered. The knife now reversed in his grip for a downward strike. Professional. Cale understood that even as his body tried to react. This was not rage. This was geometry. A hand caught the man's wrist from behind and torqued it past the breaking point. The snap was audible over traffic noise. The knife clattered on the sidewalk. Secret Service Agent Brannock drove the man face first into the concrete and pinned him with a knee between the shoulder blades. The attacker's cheek pressed flat against the pavement. His eyes were open. They were calm. Even with his wrist broken and his face on the ground, his eyes were calm. Two more agents materialized from the trail car. One secured the knife in an evidence bag. The other forced the attacker's arms behind his back and cuffed him with a practiced motion that took less than 2 seconds. Cale pressed his palm against the cut on his flank and watched his blood bead violet on alien concrete. A woman across the street had stopped walking and was holding her phone up. A man in a delivery uniform stood frozen beside his truck with his mouth open. 16 minutes later, Cale was inside the embassy medical suite. The cut was superficial, 7 centimeters long, 2 millimeters deep. The human doctor cleaned it with a solution that stung and sealed it with a compound that smelled like burnt sugar and hardened into a flexible membrane over the wound. The doctor's hands were steady, but his eyes kept moving to Cale's skin, to the violet blood, to the plating visible beneath the open wound. He had read the xenobiology briefing. Reading it and seeing it were different things. The diplomatic damage was not superficial. Ambassador Hadley arrived before the anesthetic wore off. She was pale beneath her composure. She was furious beneath the pallor. She was already on her 3rd phone call, and she held the phone away from her mouth when she spoke to Cale. The man had no identification, she said. No wallet, no phone, surgical gloves. The knife was commercially available, but the handle had been sanded to remove prints. That is not random. Cale said nothing. He sat on the edge of the medical table and felt the anesthetic settle into the tissue around the wound like a cold hand pressing flat, and thought about the letter his Uncle Thalvor had sent before his departure. It had arrived on the formal diplomatic channel, sealed with the regent's cipher, addressed to him personally. The language had been careful. The contempt had not been. Earth was beneath the dominion. The exchange was a humiliation. A prince of the Voren bloodline did not live among lesser species to learn their customs. He endured it, if he must, and returned unchanged. That was his uncle's instruction. Not advice. A command dressed as concern. Cale had dismissed it as politics, the resentment of an older man who had governed the Dominion for 11 years during the interregnum and now faced the prospect of handing it back to a nephew he considered unformed. He was beginning to reconsider. The attacker was transferred to FBI custody within the hour. Cale was told this as a courtesy. He was also told that the man had not spoken, not a word. Not during the arrest, not during transport, not during the initial interrogation. He had stared at the wall of the holding room with those calm eyes and said nothing at all. That night, Cale stood at the window of his quarters on the 3rd floor of the embassy and looked out at the lights of Washington. The city hummed with a kind of energy that Tharveth cities did not possess. It was inefficient and overlapping and alive in a way that suggested nobody was fully in control of it. He had come to find that quality interesting. Now he found it dangerous. Somewhere in that hum was someone who had paid a man to push a knife into him, and the hum had swallowed that person whole and was humming still. He pressed his palm against the window glass and felt the cold and did not sleep. 48 hours later, 2 United States Marines reported to the Tharveth Embassy on Observatory Circle. Staff Sergeant Decker was built like a door frame, square jaw, hands that looked like they had been carved from the same material as his dress blues. He carried a sidearm on his hip and a short-barreled rifle in a discreet hard case that he set beside his chair during the introductory briefing, as if it were a lunchbox. He spoke exactly 9 words during the entire meeting. "We'll need the prince's full daily schedule." Sergeant Spencer was leaner, quieter. He had the kind of face that watched everything and reacted to nothing. His eyes moved in a continuous circuit around the room, cataloging exits, windows, furniture, personnel, and the distance between each. He positioned himself at the window before anyone told him where to stand and stayed there for 40 minutes without shifting his weight. Cale noticed that Spencer had chosen the only position in the room from which every entrance was visible simultaneously. Cale studied them the way he had been trained to study foreign officers since he was 12. His father had taught him the method before the illness took his mind. Watch the hands first, then the eyes, then the feet. A man who is dangerous will tell you with his feet before anything else. Decker's feet were planted wide, stable, a man who expected to absorb impact. Spencer's feet were close together, weight forward, a man who expected to move. Decker was the hammer. Spencer was the wire. Together they were the kind of protection detail that did not exist for diplomatic guests. They existed for people someone was actively trying to kill. "This is a precaution," Ambassador Hadley told Cale afterward, when the Marines had stepped out to begin their assessment of the building. Decker's eyes had said otherwise. Decker's eyes had walked into the room already knowing that the perimeter was compromised, and the threat was active, and the principal was alive only because the first attempt had been underpowered. The Marines moved into the embassy that night. They swept the residence floor by floor. They mapped every exit, every window, every ventilation access point large enough to admit a human body. They repositioned the furniture in Cale's quarters so that no sightline from the windows reached the bed, or the desk, or the path between them. Spencer taped blackout film over the bathroom glass without asking permission. Decker tested every lock on the floor and replaced 2 that did not meet his standard with hardware he had brought in the hard case alongside the rifle. Cale let them work. On Tharveth, a prince did not accept protection from foreign soldiers. It was a concession of weakness, an admission that the Dominion could not safeguard its own blood. The political implications alone would have ended careers. But Cale was not on Tharveth. He was on a planet where someone had already tried to open his body with a piece of sharpened steel, and his own Dominion guard detail had been standing 30 meters away facing the wrong direction when it happened. He had replayed that detail many times in the 48 hours since the attack. The Dominion guards were not incompetent. They were veterans of the Imperial Palace Guard, selected specifically for this assignment. 30 meters was too far. Facing the wrong direction was too convenient. One of those failures was possible. Both together was a choice. He did not mention that detail to Hadley. He did not need to. Decker had already flagged it in his first report. The report was classified. Cale was not supposed to have seen it. But Spencer had left a tablet unlocked on the kitchen counter for exactly 4 minutes, while Decker briefed the ambassador in the next room, and Cale had read fast enough to catch the relevant line. Dominion Protective Detail. Positioning inconsistent with standard close protection doctrine. Possible compromise. Spencer had not left that tablet unlocked by accident. Spencer did not do anything by accident. The second attempt came 11 days later, and it was not a man with a knife. Cale was being transported from the embassy to a cultural event at the Kennedy Center. Standard route, confirmed that morning through the usual coordination between the Marine Detail, the Secret Service, and the embassy's own security liaison. Lead car, the prince's vehicle, trail car. 3 vehicles, 9 personnel. Decker rode shotgun in the principal vehicle with the short-barreled rifle across his lap. Spencer was in the back seat, left side, closest to the curb. Cale sat right side, behind the driver. The armored partition between the front and rear compartments was down because Decker wanted to be able to reach the prince without going through a door. The IED was buried in a storm drain on Virginia Avenue, 200 meters past the intersection with 23rd Street. It detonated 4 seconds early. The blast wave hit the lead car and flipped it sideways across the median. The vehicle rolled once and came to rest on its roof, windows blown out, engine block shoved backward into the passenger compartment. The prince's vehicle was 40 meters behind, not far enough. The outer edge of the blast threw shrapnel and concrete into the hood and killed the engine. The windshield fractured into a white web, but held. A chunk of concrete the size of a fist hit the roof and left a dent that Cale felt in his teeth. Decker was out of the vehicle before the debris finished falling. The door was open, and he was standing in the street with the rifle up and his eyes scanning before Cale fully understood what had happened. The air was gray with dust. Car alarms were screaming from every direction. A civilian vehicle behind the trail car had swerved into a light pole, and its horn was blaring in one continuous note. "Move, now!" Spencer had Cale by the collar of his coat, pulling him across the back seat and out the left door, away from the blast side. The prince's ears were ringing. The air tasted like copper and concrete dust and something chemical that burned the back of his throat. He could see the lead car on its side through the dust cloud, one wheel still spinning slowly. He could not see whether anyone inside was moving. Small arms fire opened from a parking structure to the north. 3 shooters, controlled bursts, professional spacing. The rounds were ballistic, not energy. Human weapons. The impacts walked across the pavement in a line that tracked toward the principal vehicle. Decker put himself between the parking structure and the prince. His body was a wall. He raised the rifle and returned fire with a precision that Cale had never seen from any soldier, human or Tharvith. 3 rounds. Pause. 2 rounds. He was not spraying. He was not suppressing. He was buying geometry, forcing the shooters to adjust their positions, creating angles that pulled their fire away from the prince. Spencer pushed Cale behind the engine block of the principal vehicle and covered the southern approach with his sidearm. His breathing was even. His hands were steady. He looked like a man who had done this before and expected to do it again, and did not find either fact remarkable. The trail car team dismounted and engaged the parking structure from the east side. 2 agents advanced on foot while a third provided cover fire from behind the trail car's open door. The exchange lasted 90 seconds. 1 shooter was killed. His body fell from the second level of the parking structure and landed on the sidewalk below. 2 others disappeared into the structure's stairwells and were gone before Metro Police sealed the exit 7 minutes later. Cale sat behind the engine block with his back against the tire and his hands flat on the pavement and breathed. The violet blood from his flank wound, still healing, had seeped through the new skin and stained the inside of his shirt. He could feel it, warm and wrong. Not from a new injury, from the old one, reopened by the impact. His body reminding him that it had not yet finished repairing the last time someone tried to kill him. The IED had been buried within the previous 72 hours. The street had been inspected 5 days prior and cleared. The route had only been confirmed that morning through a secure channel. The parking structure shooters had pre-positioned with weapons, ammunition, and escape routes that included vehicles on 3 different levels. This was not an improvised attack. This was an operation. Decker delivered his assessment to Hadley in the embassy's secure room at 0200. He had not slept. He did not look like he needed to. The route was leaked. The shooters were contracted. The IED was overkill for a single vehicle, which means it was designed to be seen, not just to kill. A shaped charge would have been more effective against an armored car. This was a blast device. Fragmentation. Maximum visual impact. Someone wants this to look like a failure of Earth's protection. Hadley stared at him. You are saying this was staged. I am saying the first attack used a lone man with a knife and no ID. This one used military-grade ordnance and a coordinated fire team with escape routes planned to the minute. That is not escalation. That is a campaign. 2 different methods. 2 different scales. Same objective. Whoever is running this is not trying to kill the prince. They are trying to create a narrative. Hadley was silent for a long time. A narrative for whom? For whoever needs a reason to kill him. In his quarters, Cale sat on the edge of his bed and pressed his palms together the way his mother had taught him before she died. A Tharvith centering gesture. The palms pressed flat, and the fingers interlaced, and the pressure was held until the heartbeat slowed and the mind cleared. She had taught him when he was 7. She had been dead for 14 years. He held the gesture for a long time and did not think about the spinning wheel of the overturned lead car, or the sound the rounds had made hitting the pavement, or the flat, calm eyes of the man who had held the knife 3 weeks ago. His hands did not shake. He made sure of that. Then he opened the encrypted channel to the Dominion and requested a status report on his uncle's political movements. The channel was dead. He tried the secondary frequency. Dead. The tertiary diplomatic relay. Dead. 3 channels, maintained by 3 separate systems, all silent simultaneously. That was not a malfunction. That was a design. Cale closed the terminal and sat in the dark for a long time. 11,000 light-years away, Dr. Harlan Moss was running out of time and places to hide. He had arrived in the Dominion capital of Vorinthal almost 1 year ago as Earth's representative in the exchange program. A systems scientist from the Rand Corporation, credentials in adaptive governance and institutional modeling, selected because his work focused on how power structures maintained stability and how they failed. The Tharvith had given him access to their administrative archives as a gesture of diplomatic reciprocity, the same way Earth had opened its universities and cultural institutions to Prince Cale. The access was genuine. The Tharvith did not believe a human could understand their bureaucratic systems well enough to find anything dangerous. They were wrong about that. Harlan Moss had spent 20 years studying how institutions concealed dysfunction. The language was alien. The patterns were universal. He spent 4 months cataloging bureaucratic structures and writing polite reports that said nothing important. He attended formal dinners. He asked careful questions. He learned enough of the Tharvith administrative language to navigate the archives without a translator, which his hosts found charming and slightly amusing, the way one might find it charming that a dog had learned to open a door. Then he found the funding discrepancy. It was buried in the military procurement records, nested inside a subledger that tracked disbursements for what was labeled regional security augmentation. A series of payments routed through the Sorath Merchant House, one of the largest commercial entities in the Dominion, to unlisted security battalions that did not appear in any official order of battle. The amounts were enormous. Not by human standards, but by the standards of a government that tracked every military unit to the individual soldier. The existence of funded battalions with no official designation was a hole in the fabric of the state. The authorization codes traced back to the office of the Imperial Regent, which was Theodore Voren's title while his nephew was off-world. Moss had pulled the thread carefully, quietly. He spent 6 weeks mapping the network, working late in the archives after the Tharvith staff had gone home, copying records onto a personal data device that he kept in a hollowed-out section of a human novel he kept on his desk. The novel was Moby Dick. The Tharvith had no interest in human literature. It was the safest hiding place on the planet. Lord Sorath was the financier. His merchant house had diverted trade revenues into a parallel military fund that existed nowhere in the official budget. Theodore was the architect. The unlisted battalions were being positioned in the capital and along the palace perimeter under the cover of routine security rotations. The loyalist military commanders, officers who had served under Kale's father, and who would have recognized the irregular deployments for what they were, had been reassigned to frontier posts one by one over the previous 8 months. Their replacements owed their commissions to the regent. It was a coup. Clean, methodical, patient, designed to be complete before anyone could respond. And the timing was not coincidental. If Prince Kale died on Earth, humanity would be blamed, and the Dominion would have its justification for a hostile posture, an embargo, a military buildup, possibly a war. If Kale survived and returned, he would walk into a capital already under his uncle's control, and Moss's presence in the archives would be reframed as espionage. The human scientist, rooting through military records. Proof that Earth had sent a spy. Either way, the conspirators held the board. Moss transmitted his findings on a narrow-band diplomatic frequency at 0347 local time from a maintenance corridor beneath the Hall of Administrative Records. The corridor smelled like machine lubricant and recycled air. He crouched beside a conduit junction and used a personal transmitter that had been built into the lining of his travel case by the State Department's technical division. It was the only piece of equipment he carried that the Tharvith did not know about. He used a personal encryption key that only the Earth Embassy on Tharvith could decode. The message was compressed, burst transmitted in a 1.3-second window, and included the full financial map, the battalion positions, the reassignment timeline, and a single line of plain text. Prince must not return unprepared. Coup in progress. Theodore and Sorath. Loyalists being purged. He did not know if it got through. The Dominion's communication networks had been experiencing selective outages for the past week. Not full blackouts. Targeted interruptions that affected specific frequencies for specific durations. Another pattern he had cataloged too late. He powered down the transmitter, hid it behind a conduit panel, and walked back to his guest quarters as if he had simply gone for a late walk. The corridors of the administrative complex were empty, except for a Tharvith security officer who stood at the far end of the hallway leading to the guest wing. The officer watched Moss approach. Moss nodded politely and said good evening in Tharvith, and kept his breathing even and his pace unhurried, and did not look back after he passed. The door to his quarters closed behind him, and he stood in the dark and pressed his forehead against the wall and allowed himself 30 seconds of fear. Then he straightened and began preparing for the likelihood that the message had not gone through and that he would need to find another way. The message reached Earth 9 hours later. It arrived at the State Department's extraterrestrial communications desk at 1614 Eastern Time. The analyst on duty read it twice, verified the encryption signature, and hand-carried it upstairs. By 1630, it was in the hands of the National Security Advisor. By 1645, the National Security Advisor had called the Secretary of Defense. By 1700, the full text was on the desk of the Marine Detail Commander at the Tharvith Embassy on Observatory Circle. Decker read it once, read it again, read it a third time. Then he walked to the prince's quarters, closed the door, and told Kale Voren everything. The prince listened without interruption. He sat in the chair by the window where he had spent so many nights looking out at the city that had tried to kill him, and he listened to a Marine staff sergeant from a planet his uncle considered beneath. Contempt explained that his uncle was dismantling his inheritance piece by piece. When Decker finished, Cale stood and walked to the window. He looked out at the lights of Washington for a long time. This city that had tried to kill him twice. This planet where a man with a knife and a bomb and a storm drain had been sent to end his life so that a war could begin. This planet that was now the only place telling him the truth. "How soon can we leave?" he asked. 48 hours, Decker said. "Maybe less. My uncle will have the orbital defense network by now. If we arrive without clearance, they will fire on us." "Then we get clearance. From whom? The loyalists are being removed." Decker did not answer immediately. He was not a diplomat. He was not a strategist. He was a Marine staff sergeant who had been assigned to keep one alien prince alive on foreign soil, and now the mission had changed into something that did not have a field manual. The mission had become, get the prince home through a blockade into a war zone and keep him alive long enough to take a throne from a man who had spent a decade preparing to steal it. "We'll figure that out on the way," he said. Cale looked at him, studied him the way he studied everyone, looking for the lie, the angle, the calculation, the political maneuvering that every Tharvith learned to detect before they learned to walk. There was nothing. Just a man with a rifle and a job, and the flat certainty that the job would get done regardless of whether the universe cooperated. Cale had never encountered that before. Not from his own guard. Not from his uncle's court. Not from the elaborate political machinery of the dominion that had surrounded him since birth. On Tharvith, certainty was always conditional, always hedged, always contingent on alignment and advantage, and the shifting calculus of who owed what to whom. This man owed Cale nothing. He had been assigned a job. He intended to complete it. The simplicity of that was something Cale could not fully understand, but he found it admirable in a way nothing on Tharvith had ever been. "Then we leave," the prince said. Spencer appeared in the doorway. He had not been summoned. He had not been in the adjacent room. He had simply heard the conversation shift into operational territory and materialize the way he always did, silently and exactly on time, as if the walls themselves had delivered him. "I'll start packing," he said. Cale almost smiled. Almost. The muscles around his mouth moved a fraction and then stopped, as if the gesture was one he recognized but had not yet learned to complete on this planet. Outside, Washington hummed and glowed, and did not know that an empire was falling 11,000 light-years away. Inside, a prince who had come to Earth for peace began preparing for war. The transport was not military. It was a diplomatic shuttle, repurposed and refueled in 11 hours at Andrews. The State Department had pulled strings that did not officially exist. The shuttle's transponder broadcast a neutral trade frequency. Its hull was unarmored. Its only defense was anonymity. Decker hated everything about it. He sat in the forward compartment with a tablet displaying the Dominion's orbital defense grid as it had existed 1 year ago. The data was outdated. He knew that. Spencer knew that. The prince knew that. But it was what they had. "The corridor between the 2nd and 4th orbital stations has the widest gap," Cale said from across the aisle. He had not slept. His eyes had the flat, focused quality of someone running calculations behind them. "My uncle will have reinforced the primary approach vectors, but the secondary trade lanes require automated clearance codes that cycle every 9 hours. If the codes have not been changed—" "Have they been changed?" Spencer asked from the rear seat. He was cleaning his rifle. He had been cleaning it for 20 minutes. It had been clean after 5. "I do not know," Cale Vorin said. "The communication channels are still dead." Decker set the tablet down. "What happens if we come in on a trade lane and the codes are wrong?" "The station fires. Automated kinetic response. No warning shot. No hail." "How long between detection and impact?" 4 seconds. Spencer stopped cleaning his rifle. Decker looked at the prince. The prince looked back. There was no panic in his expression. There was something worse. Acceptance. Not of death. Of the mathematics. 4 seconds was 4 seconds. Either the codes worked, or the conversation they were having right now was the last one they would ever have. "There is another option," Cale said. "The codes my father gave me before he died. Emergency sovereign access. They override the automated systems and open a direct channel to the Palace Defense Command." "And if your uncle controls Palace Defense Command?" "Then he knows we are coming, and we lose surprise. Do we have surprise now?" Cale paused. "No. He will know I left Earth. The diplomatic shuttle's departure would have been flagged within hours. He does not know our approach vector. That is what we have. Not surprise. Geometry." Decker almost respected the answer. He would have preferred a platoon of Marines and a ship with guns, but geometry was something he understood. "Use your father's codes," Decker said. "If your uncle already knows we're coming, surprise is gone anyway. I'd rather have a clear lane than a 4-second coin flip." Cale nodded once. He entered the codes into the shuttle's navigation system himself. His fingers moved across the alien interface without hesitation. Whatever he was feeling, his hands were steady. The shuttle crossed into Dominion space at 0314 ship time. Nothing fired. The sovereign codes opened the corridor like a key turning in a lock. The orbital stations registered the shuttle, flagged it, and then cleared it in sequence. Decker watched the defense grid on his tablet, each station blinking from red to amber to green as they passed. "We're through," Spencer said. Nobody relaxed. The Dominion capital was called Vorenthal. Cale had described it once during the weeks on Earth, briefly, without sentiment. A city of 9 million built around the palace compound on a river delta. Spires of dark stone, bridges that glowed with embedded energy conduits, a place that had not seen war in 200 years. It was burning. They saw it from orbit. Fires across the eastern districts, columns of smoke bent sideways by wind. The commercial port was dark, no ships moving in or out. The military port on the western plateau was active but scattered, vessels positioned without formation, some listing at their berths. Cale stood behind the pilot's seat and stared at the display. His homeworld, his city, his inheritance. He said nothing for a long time. "Where is the Loyalist Command?" Decker asked. "The military headquarters is there." Cale pointed to a structure on the northern edge of the city. The feeds showed damage. One wall collapsed. Vehicles overturned in the surrounding streets. "It appears to have fallen." "When?" "Recently. The fires are still hot." Spencer moved to the opposite display and pulled up what sensor data the shuttle could gather. "I'm reading weapons discharge signatures across the central corridor. Energy weapons. Heavy. And something else. Kinetic impacts. Explosive ordnance." "Probably the unlisted battalions," Cale said. His voice was flat, clinical. "Sorath's money. My uncle's orders. They have moved." "Is the palace still held by Loyalists?" Decker asked. Cale worked the sensors. The palace compound sat at the center of Vorenthal like a stone fist on the river delta. High walls, shield generators at the four corners, a single main gate facing the ceremonial boulevard. "The shields are active. That means someone inside is still fighting. The generators require manual authorization from the throne room or the defense annex. If my uncle controlled the palace, he would have dropped the shields and declared authority." "So Loyalists hold the palace, but the city is gone," Decker said. "The city is contested. The palace is besieged." Decker looked at Spencer. Spencer looked back. They had the same thought at the same time, the way they always did after 3 deployments together. The thought was simple, and it was not good. They were about to land in the middle of a civil war with 2 rifles, 3 sidearms, and a prince. "Where do we put down?" Spencer asked. Cale pointed to a structure inside the palace walls. "The Sovereign landing pad. My father's codes should open the shield aperture for a single vessel." "Should?" "Will. The Sovereign codes are hardwired into the shield architecture. They cannot be overridden without physically dismantling the generators. And if someone has physically dismantled the generators? Cale looked at him. Then the shields would not be up. Spencer conceded the point with a nod. They descended through smoke and turbulence. The shuttle was not built for combat insertion. It shuddered and groaned through the thermal layers rising from the burning districts. Decker strapped in and watched the altimeter and thought about every helicopter insertion he had ever done in places where the landing zone was hot and the briefing was wrong. This was worse. This was worse because the landing zone was an alien palace on an alien world, and the briefing was a 6-month-old data file. The shield aperture opened, a gap in the energy barrier just wide enough for the shuttle, lasting exactly 8 seconds. The pilot threaded it with 2 seconds to spare. The shuttle touched down on dark stone inside the palace compound. Decker was out first, rifle up, scanning. The landing pad was intact. The air smelled like ozone and something chemical he did not recognize. Smoke drifted across the compound in low sheets. He could hear weapons fire to the north, energy weapons. The sound was different from anything he had trained against, a sharp, tearing crack instead of the percussive thump of ballistic ordnance. Spencer exited and flanked right. They moved in the pattern they had rehearsed 1,000 times, covering each other's blind spots without verbal communication. Cale stepped out last. He stood on the stone of his ancestors and listened to his world come apart. The weapons fire was closer than it had sounded from inside the shuttle. North wall, maybe 300 meters. A door at the base of the nearest tower opened, and 4 Tharvath soldiers spilled out, weapons raised. They wore the bronze and black of the Imperial Palace Guard, loyalists. Their weapons were pointed at the shuttle. Cale stepped forward before Decker could stop him. He spoke in Tharvath, fast, commanding. A voice Decker had never heard from him before, not the quiet, observant exchange student who had lived in their embassy for a year. Something older, something that had been waiting. The soldiers lowered their weapons. All of them dropped to a knee. An officer followed them out of the tower, older, battle damage on his armor, burn marks across the left side of his face. He looked at Cale, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition. The acknowledgement that the situation had changed. He spoke. Cale translated without turning around. Commander Velthor, Palace Guard. He says the north wall has been breached twice in the last 6 hours. They have pushed back both times, but they are losing people. Thalvor's forces control the outer city. Lord Sorath's personal guard is leading the assault on the main gate. The Loyalist military command fell 8 hours ago. There is no relief coming. How many defenders? Decker asked. Cale relayed the question. The answer came back, and the prince paused before translating. 87, down from 300. Spencer did the math silently. 87 defenders in a compound designed for thousands against a force that had already taken the city. The math did not work. The math was not supposed to work. Sieges ended one way when the numbers looked like that. The throne room, Cale said. I need to reach the throne room. Why? Decker asked. Because the palace defense systems are controlled from the throne. Full access, shield modulation, internal barriers, automated turrets that have been dormant since my grandfather's war. If I reach the throne, I can activate the deep defenses. It will not win, but it will hold. Decker measured the distance in his head. Landing pad to the central tower, maybe 400 meters across open courtyards and covered corridors, through a compound that was under active siege. Spencer, yeah. We're moving to the throne room. Standard close protection. The prince stays between us. Copy. Cale turned to Commander Velthor and spoke again. The commander nodded. He assigned 2 of his soldiers to escort them and turned back to the tower to continue managing a defense that was already dying. Cale looked at Decker. The prince's eyes were different now. They had been different since he stepped off the shuttle. Something had unlocked. The careful observer was still there, but behind it was a man who had decided something. Decker had seen that look before, on the faces of men who had stopped calculating whether they would survive and started calculating what they would do with whatever time remained. "Staff Sergeant," Cale said. "Sir." "My uncle expects me to run. My uncle expects me to negotiate. My uncle has planned for every version of my return, except the one where I fight." Decker checked his rifle. Full magazine. One spare. Spencer had the same. "Then let's go disappoint your uncle," Decker said. They moved into the palace. Behind them, the north wall shook with another impact. Dust fell from the ancient stone. The weapons fire grew closer. The prince did not look back. The first corridor was clear. The second was not. Decker heard them before he saw them. Boots on stone. Fast. Coordinated. Coming from the junction ahead, where the corridor split toward the eastern wing. He raised a closed fist, and the group stopped. Cale and the two Tharvith escorts pressed against the wall. Spencer dropped to a knee and aimed down the corridor behind them. 3 soldiers came around the corner. They wore black armor without insignia, Sorath's personal guard. They had breached somewhere on the eastern side, and they were moving inward. Decker fired twice. The first round took the lead soldier in the chest and dropped him flat. The second caught the man behind him in the throat. The third soldier got one shot off. The energy bolt scorched the wall above Decker's head, close enough that he felt the heat on his scalp. One of the Tharvith escorts returned fire, and the soldier went down. "Move!" Decker said. They stepped over the bodies and kept going. The corridors of the palace were wide and high-ceilinged, built for processions, not firefights. No cover, except the stone columns that lined each hall at 20-meter intervals. Decker hated it. Every intersection was an ambush point. Every doorway was a question mark. They reached the central atrium, a vast open space beneath a domed ceiling that had been painted with the history of the Voron dynasty. Some of the panels were cracked. Dust and debris covered the mosaic floor. A section of the upper gallery had collapsed, spilling stone and metal across the eastern approach. The throne room was on the far side, 200 meters across open ground. Decker looked at Spencer. Spencer looked at the atrium. The calculation was the same one they had both made in Fallujah, in Helmand, in every shattered building where the distance between cover was the distance between living and not. "No way around?" Decker asked. Cale shook his head. "The lateral corridors connect to the eastern wing. That is where the breach is. This is the only clear path." Weapons fire echoed from somewhere below them, the lower levels. Sorath's forces were pushing through multiple entry points. "We go fast," Decker said. "Prince in the middle, Spencer on rear, Tharvith escorts on flanks, column formation. Do not stop for anything." They ran. Halfway across the atrium, a door on the upper gallery burst open, and 4 more black-armored soldiers appeared on the balcony above. They had the high ground, and they used it. Energy bolts rained down in sharp, tearing bursts that blew chunks from the mosaic floor. One of the Tharvith escorts took a bolt through the shoulder and spun sideways. He hit the ground hard but kept moving, dragging himself toward a collapsed pillar with his weapon in his remaining good hand. Spencer turned, dropped to one knee, and put 3 rounds into the gallery. One soldier fell over the railing and hit the atrium floor with a sound Decker did not want to remember. The others pulled back behind the balcony wall. "Go!" Spencer shouted. Decker had Cale by the arm, and they were running. The second Tharvith escort laid suppressing fire at the gallery. Spencer moved backward, firing in controlled bursts, covering the retreat across the open ground. They reached the far corridor. Decker pushed Cale through the archway and flattened against the wall. Spencer came through 4 seconds later. The second escort followed. The wounded escort did not. Cale looked back toward the atrium. "Don't," Decker said. The prince's jaw tightened. He turned and kept moving. The throne room doors were 15 meters ahead, massive, dark metal inlaid with patterns that glowed faintly with residual energy. 2 palace guards stood at the entrance, weapons raised. They saw Cale and immediately stepped aside. Cale placed his palm against a panel beside the door. It read something. Bioelectric signature. Genetic imprint. Whatever the Tharvith used instead of keys. The doors opened inward, with a sound like a slow exhalation. The throne room was enormous. Vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. Columns of dark stone lining a central aisle that led to a raised platform. On the platform sat the throne of the Vorin dynasty. It was not ornamental. It was a command chair, integrated displays, control interfaces built into the armrests, a weapon and a seat of power in one. Cale walked to it without ceremony. He sat down. The chair recognized him. Every display in the room activated simultaneously. The palace defense grid, internal sensors, shield status, weapon systems that had been dormant for decades. His hands moved across the controls. Automated turrets along the outer walls powered up for the first time in decades. Internal blast doors began sealing corridors that had been breached. The shield generators shifted frequency, closing gaps that Sorath's forces had been exploiting. On the displays, Decker could see the effect. Sorath's advance teams were being cut off by blast doors dropping behind them. Turrets on the north wall opened fire on the siege positions outside. The assault on the main gate stalled as the defenders suddenly had fire support they had not possessed 5 minutes ago. It was not a victory. It was a tourniquet. "This will hold them for hours," Cale said. "Not days." "Hours is enough," Decker said. "What else can you do from that chair?" "Broadcast to the entire Dominion, every military channel, every civilian frequency. Then tell them their prince is home." Cale nodded. Then he opened the channels. He spoke in Tharvith. Decker did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was not a plea. It was not an announcement. It was a command. Short. Hard. The voice of a man sitting on his father's throne in a burning palace, telling his people that the line had not broken. The response came within minutes. Loyalist units that had gone dark began transmitting. Ships in the outer system changed course. The military was fractured, but it was not dead, and the sound of the sovereign voice from the throne room gave it something to rally toward. Spencer stood by the door and watched the corridor. He had not spoken in 20 minutes. Then the internal sensors flagged movement. Cale read the display. Eastern Wing, a single group, 40 soldiers, moving toward the throne room through the service corridors. The blast doors in that section are damaged. I cannot seal them. "Sorath's guard?" Decker asked. "No." Cale's voice changed. Quieter. "The signature codes belong to the Regent's personal detail. My uncle is coming himself." Decker checked his magazine. Half full, 1 spare remaining. Spencer had less. "He wants the throne," Cale said. "If he takes this room, he controls the palace systems. Everything I just activated, he can turn against the Loyalists. Then he doesn't take this room." The remaining Tharvith escort and the 2 throne room guards positioned themselves at the entrance. 5 defenders, 40 attackers. The math was familiar. The math was always bad. Decker and Spencer took positions on either side of the central aisle, using the stone columns for cover. Cale remained on the throne. He was working the defense systems, trying to reroute blast doors, trying to slow the approach. Some of it worked. Some of it did not. They heard them coming. The sound of armored boots in the service corridor beyond the eastern wall. Then a detonation. The wall buckled inward, and a breach opened in a shower of stone and dust. They came through in pairs, well-trained, well-armed. Energy weapons and ballistic sidearms both. The first pair died in the doorway. Decker and the Tharvith guards cut them down before they cleared the rubble. The next wave used the bodies as cover and pushed forward. The throne room became a killing floor. Energy bolts and ballistic rounds crossed in the dusty air. One of the throne room guards went down, then the other. The Tharvith escort took a bolt to the leg and kept firing from the ground until a second bolt found his chest. Decker burned through his last magazine. He transitioned to his sidearm. Spencer was already on his. They were falling back toward the throne platform, tightening the perimeter around the prince, giving ground because there was no other option. Then she came through the breach, Viethna Sorath. She was not armored. She wore the formal robes of a Dominion noble house, torn and filthy, as if she had crossed the burning city on foot. But she was not unarmed. She carried an energy pistol in her right hand, taken from someone who no longer needed it, and she came through the gap in the wall, moving low and fast, with a purpose that had nothing to do with negotiation. She fired twice into the service corridor behind her. 2 of her father's soldiers dropped. The others scrambled for cover, confused because the woman shooting at them wore the Sorath crest on her robes and had their lord's face in her bones. She ran up the central aisle toward the throne, toward Kale. Kale stood. His hand was on the armrest where a weapon interface glowed. Viethna Sorath reached the base of the platform and turned, putting her back to the prince, facing the breach. She raised the pistol and spoke one sentence in Tharvith without looking at Kale. Decker did not understand the words. He understood the posture. He had seen it in every soldier who had ever chosen a side and decided to hold it. She had chosen. Thalvor's soldiers regrouped and pushed through the breach in force. The throne room erupted again. Energy bolts crossed in the dusty air from every angle. Decker fired from behind the left column. Spencer fired from the right. Viethna fired from the base of the platform, disciplined, controlled, placing her shots with a precision that said she had trained for this, even if she had never expected to use it. A bolt hit the column above Decker's head and showered him with stone fragments. He ducked, repositioned, kept firing. Spencer dropped a soldier coming through the breach and transitioned to the next target without pause. The last Tharvith escort, still bleeding from the leg wound, dragged himself behind a fallen section of wall and fired one-handed. The bolt that killed Viethna came from the right side of the breach. It was not aimed at her. It was aimed at the throne platform, at the prince, a wild shot fired by a soldier who was already falling backward from a round Spencer had put into his chest. The dying man's hand clenched, and the weapon discharged at an angle that no one had calculated for. It caught Viethna in the side of her neck. She dropped without a sound. The energy pistol clattered on the stone. She fell at the base of the throne platform, 3 meters from the prince, and the formal robes that bore her father's crest settled around her on the ancient floor. Her eyes were open. She was looking up at the vaulted ceiling, where the history of the Vorin dynasty had been painted centuries ago. Kale saw her fall. He saw the way her body folded. He saw the light leave a face he had known since they were children, promised to each other by families who had believed the future was something you could arrange. He did not cry out. He did not kneel beside her. He looked at her for 2 seconds. 2 seconds was what he allowed himself. Then something behind his eyes broke and rebuilt itself harder in the same instant, the way metal reforms after it passes through fire. Kale sat back down on the throne. He touched a control that Decker had not seen him use before. A low hum filled the room. The columns along the central aisle split open, and turret assemblies extended from inside the stone. Ancient weapons. Throne room defenses that had not been activated since the dynasty wars 3 centuries ago. It fired. The turret swept the breach and the service corridor beyond, with a precision that no living soldier could match. The sound was deafening. The result was absolute. When it stopped, there was nothing moving in the eastern approach. Decker's ears rang. Dust filled the air. The acrid smell of burned metal and something else, something organic, settled over everything. From the service corridor, through the smoke and the silence, a figure stepped forward. Thalvor Vorin. He was tall, taller than Kale. The family resemblance was there in the bone structure, the gray skin, the angular features. But where Kale's face held calculation and restraint, Thalvor's held something that had curdled long ago into entitlement. He was wounded, energy burn across his left arm. He walked with a limp. He carried no weapon. His soldiers were dead behind him. He looked at the turrets. He looked at the throne. He looked at his nephew. Thalvor took another step forward. The turrets tracked him, but did not fire. They were waiting for the command. Kale stood at the edge of the platform, 1 step from the throne, and looked down at his uncle from above. The prince and the regent faced each other across 10 meters of ruined aisle. Kale spoke. Quiet. Controlled. But there was something underneath it that Decker recognized from every interrogation room he had ever witnessed. The absolute certainty of a man who holds all remaining cards. Thalvor listened. His face did not change. When Kale finished, the silence held for 3 seconds. Then Thalvor's eyes moved. Not to Kale's face, to the throne behind him. The thing he had spent a decade planning to take. The thing that was 10 meters and 1 nephew away from being his. His right hand moved to the inside of his coat. Decker saw it first. Thalvor's fingers closed around something compact and dark and pulled it free. An energy pistol, short-barreled, the kind that palace officers carried beneath formal dress. He brought it up fast, faster than a wounded man should have been able to move, and leveled it at Kale. Decker fired twice. Both rounds hit Thalvor in the center of his chest. The impacts drove him backward a full step. But he did not fall. The subcutaneous plating beneath his skin, the same cartilage armor that every Tharvith carried, absorbed the ballistic rounds and held. Thalvor staggered. The pistol wavered. 1 second. That was what Decker had bought. Kale used it. He turned, dropped into the throne, and his hand found the control interface the way a hand finds a weapon it has already reached for 1,000 times in the mind. The turrets fired once. The sound was short. The result was final. Thalvor Vorin's energy pistol clattered on the stone. Then there was nothing left to hold it. Decker lowered his sidearm. His ears were ringing. Spencer was beside him. Neither of them spoke. Kale descended the platform and walked down to the place where Viethna Sorath lay at the base of the steps. He knelt beside her. He looked at her face, at the eyes that were still open and looking at nothing. He stayed there, on his knees, for what felt like a long time. His hands rested on his thighs. His breathing was steady. But something in the way he held himself, the stillness of it, the absolute refusal to look away, told Decker that this was not a prince mourning a political arrangement. This was a man kneeling beside someone who had chosen him when choosing him meant dying. He reached out and closed her eyes with 2 fingers, gently. The way someone closes a book, they are not ready to finish. That was when the loyalist soldiers brought Lord Sorath in. He came through the main entrance, not the breach. 2 palace guards held him by the arms. His wrists were bound. He wore the dark formal coat of his merchant house, and it was torn at the shoulder and dusted with ash. He was smaller than Decker had expected, a merchant built like a merchant, soft in the places where soldiers were hard. His eyes were already moving around the throne room, assessing damage, calculating cost, the way a man of money assessed everything. Then he saw Kale kneeling on the floor. Then he saw what Kale was kneeling beside. He stopped walking. The guards had to hold him upright. Viethna lay where she had fallen. The robes bearing her father's crest were darkened with blood. The energy pistol she had used to shoot his own soldiers was still on the stone beside her hand. Lord Sorath made a sound. It was the sound of a man whose body understood something before his mind could catch up. A low, broken exhale, as if something fundamental had been punctured inside his chest. The guards released his arms and he ran and fell to his knees beside his daughter's body. His bound hands hovered over her face without touching it. He was shaking. The man who had financed a coup and bankrolled an army and bought the loyalty of generals was shaking on his knees beside the only thing his money could not purchase, the life of his only daughter. He looked up at Kale. There was no defiance in his face. There was nothing left in his face at all. Kale rose to his feet. He looked down at Sorath for a long time. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The throne room said it for him. The bodies, the rubble, the smoke, the daughter who had chosen the prince over her father and paid for it with everything she had. Sorath lowered his head until his forehead touched the stone beside Viethna. He stayed there. Kale turned and walked back to the throne. He sat down. The coup was over. The coronation happened 9 days later. It was not the ceremony that had been planned. There were no delegations from the outer provinces, no festival, no week-long celebration. The ceremonial boulevard was still being cleared of debris. The eastern wing of the palace was a ruin. The city smelled like smoke and wood for months. Kael Voren sat on the throne he had already bled for and received the crown from a priest whose hands were still bandaged from the siege. The surviving palace guard lined the throne room. 87 had held the walls. 31 remained. Commander Velthor stood at the front. The burns on his face were healing badly. He did not seem to care. Decker and Spencer stood at the back of the room in dress blues that had been shipped from Earth on an emergency diplomatic transport. They were the only humans in the room. They were the only humans on the planet. The priest spoke words that Decker did not understand. Kael responded. The crown was placed. It was a simple thing. Dark metal. No jewels. It looked like it had been made to survive exactly the kind of war it had just passed through. The room knelt. Kael sat on the throne and looked out over the people who remained. His people. What was left of them. His eyes found Decker at the back of the room and held there for a moment. He looked at the Marine the way a man looks at the fixed point that kept him upright when everything else was falling. Then he looked away and began his reign. Ambassador Hadley's classified report to the State Department, filed 11 days after the coronation, contained one line that was later redacted from every official copy, but survived in the personal files of the National Security Advisor. The Tharvith Dominion now has an emperor who thinks like a human. Whether that is to our advantage remains to be seen. The second line was a brief addendum regarding Dr. Harlan Moss. Loyalist forces had found him in a detention cell beneath the Hall of Administrative Records, arrested by Thalvor's security services 3 days after his transmission. He was dehydrated, underweight, and had 2 broken fingers on his left hand. He had not talked. The new emperor ordered his release personally. Moss was escorted to the diplomatic shuttle with a formal apology and a Tharvith word that had no direct translation, a word he later described as something between gratitude and debt. Decker and Spencer flew home on the same diplomatic shuttle that had carried them in. The shuttle was quiet. Spencer slept. Decker did not. He sat in the forward compartment and looked at the stars through the viewport. They were different out here. Not the stars he had grown up with in Montana. Not the constellations he had learned in boot camp, lying on his back in the sand at 29 Palms. These were the spaces between worlds, cold and indifferent and endless. He thought about all the ways a man could arrive somewhere as one thing and leave as another, and how the universe did not ask permission before it reshaped you. Spencer woke up somewhere over the void between systems. He looked at Decker. "You good?" "No." "Yeah." Spencer went back to sleep. Decker watched the stars. Somewhere behind him, an emperor was learning to carry the weight of a throne built on the bones of everyone who had tried to take it from him. Ahead of him, Earth waited, small and blue, and unaware of what it had helped create. He closed his eyes. He did not sleep, but he closed them anyway.
Hey there, space human. I'm really curious about your thoughts on this video. Drop a quick comment and let me know what's on your mind. Or just say hi if you prefer. Either way, I'd love to hear from you. Also, remember to check the pinned comment. Trust me, it's worth a look. Oh, and one last thing. I've chosen another video for you to watch. Just click the card here, or here if you want the whole playlist. See you there.